21st century China is modernizing at breakneck speed. For the last century or so, it seemed that China was merely trying to catch up with standards of science and technology set by the West.
But if you take the longer view, if your perspective is not a few hundred years, but a few thousand years, by any measure it was China that was at the vanguard of science and technology. In fact, it turns out that many Western inventions were not inventions at all, but borrowings from China. If we want to explain the blossoming of knowledge in the West, it pays to look east, to what the Chinese knew. Normally we think of fire as a destructive element, but it can also be a force for creation.
Early Chinese alchemists believed the secret to eternal life and powerful medicines lay in combining just the right ingredients over a fire. Some recipes even called for heating concoctions up to a year. Around 300 AD, the alchemists began to create elixirs of sulfur, saltpeter, and various plants. It took another 700 years of singed beards and charred houses before researchers learned to add pure charcoal to sulfur and saltpeter. Blending the three made what they called huo yao, the fire drug. By sheer coincidence, they discovered gunpowder. The new invention created bright sparks, and so the Chinese used it for celebration. They invented the world's first fireworks. After fireworks, it didn't take long for gunpowder to find its new destiny: war. For thousands of years, arrows were the primary weapon in Chinese warfare. But around 1150 AD, during the Song dynasty, someone came up with the idea to tie a bamboo tube packed with gunpowder to the arrow and add a fuse. Next, they attached a tiny iron weight near the feathers to tilt the arrowhead up for a longer flight. It was the world's first rocket. But the idea was in its infancy. Over the next 2 centuries, weapons designers found ways to maximize the rocket's potential. To make it more powerful, they drilled holes straight through the center of the gunpowder so that the powder burnt evenly and shot the gas backward, causing the arrow to streak directly forward. Then they constricted the opening at the back, raising the pressure inside the tube to create even more thrust. This type of rocket had a range of up to 10 football fields. But firing one rocket at a time is not very effective. So they developed a multiple rocket launcher. These rockets used a non-explosive gunpowder which simply propelled the arrows forward. Although they didn't explode, they did enough to stun and amaze the Emperor's enemies. So you can thank the Chinese for your 4th of July light show. The Chinese also found inspiration in another basic element: water. The early Chinese reaped the benefits of water by rerouting rivers and creating vast systems of canals. Water was not only used for practical purposes, it also reflected the way the Chinese viewed the earth. They even saw water when they looked to the heavens above. The North Star. Because the North Star's position remained constant, the Chinese used it to map the location of every other star in the sky. This method of positioning stars is called the equatorial system, and the Chinese have been using it for about 2,000 years, nearly 2 millennia before the West. This is an equatorially mounted instrument called an armillary sphere, used to measure positions of the moon and planets. It is housed at the National Astronomical Instrument Museum in Beijing.
This is where modern astronomy begins. For the system used here, of the equatorial armillary, is the same system adopted by Western astronomers and which is still used today in modern observatories. The difference being, of course, is that we have a great big whacking telescope with which to see the stars. But in its day, this was state-of-the-art.
The armillary is lined up with the North Star. Chinese astronomers pinpointed stars with the sighting tube and then catalogued their location by counting the markings on the rotating rings. The first equatorial armillaries were built around the 1st century AD, but 1200 years later, Chinese astronomers were using it to predict the positions of the heavenly bodies to within a 20th of a degree. Not bad for the naked eye. They frequently used water to drive simple machines, which mimicked the motion of the stars. The problem they faced was keeping the mechanism operating at a precise rate. Su Sung solved that problem with a mechanism which today is known as a mechanical escapement. Inside Su Sung's armillary clock, a stream of water turned a large wheel equipped with cups. As the measured weight of water forced one cup down, the wheel moved forward one cog. A series of weights and locks kept it from recoiling or from moving forward too quickly. This mechanical escapement captured time in precise increments. A chain drive, another Chinese invention, rotated the armillary at the top. One complete rotation for each day, replicating the movement of the stars. Although this machine was primarily used as an astronomical showpiece, its mechanical escapement was the foundation of modern mechanical clocks. In a few hundred years, China would drop this technology while the West, much later, went on to create clocks using weights and springs instead of water to drive the escapement. It is in this bucolic atmosphere that I find remnants of another ancient Chinese technology that dates from the 2nd century BC. Paper. Villagers here in Jinhua earn their living by making paper the traditional way, sheet by sheet. Gathering the material they use to make paper is as simple as going into the backyard. The villagers use bamboo, which grows in abundance on these mountainsides. Workers cut the bamboo down, dry it, and chop it into chips. Then they steam the chips until they're crumbly and moist. Next, the bamboo is soaked in bleach and ground into a thick mush. Once the mush is white, they grind it again into liquid pulp, perfect for paper. 3 centuries ago, the process took 100 days. Now it takes a week. Once they've suspended the pulp in a vat of water, they use screens to gather a thin layer and then lay the new paper out to drain with one sweeping, elegant motion. This family has been making paper here for 14 generations, nearly 300 years. In the beginning, paper wasn't anywhere near as thin as these sheets drying on the wall. In fact, people used the earliest paper to make blankets and clothing accessories. Eventually, the Chinese refined the process and created a smooth, thin material, ideal for writing. 1,000 years later, long before the West had even started making paper, the Chinese were already working on a new idea, the printed word. Printing was an idea that flourished around 1000 AD, once again during the Song dynasty. From then on, information could be easily duplicated and distributed, including the first methods of print, a simple process which revolutionized the intellectual world.
What we're seeing here is the process of printing from a woodcut. Now, all a woodcut is a piece of wood with the image you want carved in reverse. You take ink, apply it to the wood, put on your piece of paper, apply pressure, and you have a printed image.
Having come up with the woodcut, the Chinese then ran with the idea. They made small woodcuts with individual characters inscribed on the back. They had invented, in other words, movable type. It was another critical invention that arose during the Song dynasty. But the reason movable type didn't take off in China was that instead of using a few dozen letters, they used thousands of characters, each one representing a different word. This obstacle limited the use of movable type, but printing continued. It was in China that the information age truly began.
By 812 AD, the Chinese had combined two of their greatest innovations, paper and printing, to produce a third. It comes in all shapes and sizes, makes the world go round, and it is, of course, paper money. Now, the Chinese called it flying money because it flew out of their pockets, which is a problem I still have. However, it was destined for a very long career. Western Europe got its first printed money in Sweden in 1661. The US wouldn't see printed money until 1690.
Developing a new technology that would reshape the world. Artisans in China have been throwing pottery for thousands of years. But by the 1st century AD, they had created something completely new, called porcelain. To make it, Chinese potters mixed pure kaolin clay with porcelain stone. But the crucial ingredient was heat. It takes temperatures of about 2400 degrees Fahrenheit to fuse clay into these delicate, glass-like pieces born of earth, water, and fire. The West wouldn't create porcelain for another 1700 years.
One of the reasons why the rest of the world had to come here to get its porcelain was that nowhere else did they have a furnace capable of generating the high temperatures you need to make true porcelain.
The Chinese mastered intense heat when they learned how to turn common iron ore into cast iron and, ultimately, into steel. The secret to achieving extreme temperatures for their famous porcelain was known to the Chinese for centuries. They created furnaces using refractory or heat-resistant clay tiles, which could withstand enough heat to transform iron ore. Able to pour this molten iron into molds, the ancient Chinese discovered the world's first cast iron and quickly put it to work in their fields. With wrought iron, you have to hammer out each item, one at a time. But with cast iron, you can easily replicate products like this plough from a mold, again and again.
This design represented a huge increase in efficiency on anything that had gone before. For one, it could be produced relatively quickly and economically. But the real advantage was here, in the field. With a plough like this, he could pull the plough along with a fraction of the effort needed to pull a conventional plough. The part of the plough that does the work is known as the share, the point here. And with a plough such as this, you drastically reduce the effort you need to cut the soil. At the same time as the ploughshare cuts the earth, the mould board turns the soil in the air. Now, if that seems obvious, that's because every great idea seems obvious in retrospect, but it wasn't obvious to anyone outside China.
Cast iron allowed the Chinese to mass-produce farm equipment like this, quickly and easily, but it was far from perfect. The high content of carbon in cast iron makes the metal fairly brittle, so the ancient Chinese created a metal with more resilience: steel.
This is a 21st century blast furnace. It's called a blast furnace because there's a machine, like a giant hot air dryer, that blows air in from the top. The more oxygen in the furnace, the higher the temperature, the less carbon in the mix, the different properties of steel at the end. The basic principles, this wonderful alchemy of carbon, iron and oxygen, were known to the Chinese over 2,000 years ago.
Here at the firing range that I find simplified replicas of the deadly weaponry used to defend the thriving Sung Empire.
For over 2,000 years, this was a standard issue weapon in the Chinese arsenal. It is, of course, a crossbow, and it is yet another Chinese invention. A standard bow is ultimately limited by the strength in the archer's arm. But with this, you can store the tension in this bow and release it when you please with a trigger. This is a very crude mechanism of a crossbow, but we know that by the 3rd century BC, the Chinese were making these to a quite extraordinary degree of precision, with bronze trigger mechanisms with 3 moving parts.
The trigger worked like this. A warrior could pull back the bowstring using the weight of his body and store all that tension by sliding the string behind 2 hooks. Pulling the trigger released the hooks and sent the bolt flying. It was crucial that the bronze trigger was precise. They said that if the trigger was off by the width of a grain of rice, it wouldn't work. This lethal Chinese invention would not be surpassed until the age of the firearm. But the most important lesson the ancient Chinese learned from kite technology was how to ride the wind.
For the greater part of the history of sailing, the technology of Chinese sailboats has been drastically superior to anything that any Westerner had. Much of that superiority lay in the sails. This is called a batten sail. The battens are the strips of bamboo, and the advantage of them is that they give mariners great flexibility. If the wind is strong, they can only raise 1 or 2 battens. If the wind is weak, they can raise them all.
The parallel battens keep the sail from billowing out too far and losing thrust. Another revolutionary innovation was aligning pivoting sails along the axis of the boat, so they could catch the wind from different directions.
In the West, sails tended to be at right angles with the boat, and that meant they could only sail properly when the wind was behind them. But with this, you could sail with the wind in 3/4. If it looks familiar, that's because every modern Western yacht you've seen has copied this design.
The West borrowed other Chinese maritime innovations: rudders to steer ships, leeboards to reduce downwind drift, and watertight compartments to keep boats afloat, even if the hull was breached.
Originally, compasses pointed not north, but south, and the original compasses looked like this. By the 4th century BC, Chinese alchemists had discovered the properties of lodestone, a naturally occurring magnetic material which, if left free to spin, would align itself with the Earth's magnetic field.
These early compasses were called south pointers because the spoon-shaped lodestone always pointed south. Chinese sailors found the compass indispensable on water. By the 12th century, large fleets of Chinese junks were roaming the Earth, sailing as far as Africa.